All right, let's unlock some creative magic today.
Sounds exciting.
We're diving deep into Elizabeth Gilbert's big magic.
Ah, a classic.
It's all about, well, living a more creative life,
Right.
but beyond like the fear and self-doubt that can hold us back.
Look, those pesky things.
Gilbert explores themes of courage, permission, persistence, trust,
The good stuff.
and even, a touch of the divine when it comes to creativity.
Interesting.
So the big question is, are you ready to discover the big magic within you?
I think a lot of people are searching for that.
Totally. And you know what's fascinating to me? Gilbert kicks things off not with her own story,
Oh,
but with the story of this poet named Jack Gilbert,
okay.
not related to Elizabeth, just, a cool coincidence with the name.
Yeah, how about that?
But I feel like she's setting the stage with this example of a life truly dedicated to creative passion.
I see.
This guy chose poetry over pretty much everything else.
Wow.
Almost like a monk, can you imagine?
That's dedicated.
He grew up in Pittsburgh, surrounded by, like, steel mills and industry.
Not exactly the bohemian artist's haven.
Right. And then he chooses this life of relative isolation,
Interesting.
pouring all his energy into his craft.
Mm.
His poetry collections were like these rare blooms appearing years apart.
He took his time.
And he clearly had talent, right?
Oh, for sure.
He won awards, was even nominated for a Pulitzer.
Impressive.
Yet he wasn't chasing fame or fortune.
Not at all.
But what do you make of that choice? Like, why not embrace the spotlight?
I think it points to a different kind of motivation,
Yeah.
Not about external validation, but about answering a deeper creative calling.
Hmm.
It reminds me of that story Gilbert tells about Jack advising a student,
Oh, yeah.
asking her, "Do you have the courage to bring forth this work?"
Wow.
Such a powerful question, right?
It is.
Because it really challenges us to consider, what treasures might we be holding back?
Hmm.
What fears are preventing us from stepping into our full creative potential?
It's almost like he's asking, what are you willing to risk to bring your work into the world?
Exactly.
And that leads us to what I find so compelling about Gilbert's definition of creative living.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's not about being a professional artist, necessarily.
Right.
It's about living a life fueled by curiosity, not fear.
Curiosity, I like that.
Like her friend Susan, for example,
Okay.
who took up figure skating at 40.
You're kidding.
Not to compete or anything, just for the pure joy of it.
That's awesome.
Imagine that 3 mornings a week, before work,
Wow.
she'd be out on the ice, gliding, spinning, finding this sense of,
Freedom.
beauty and transcendence through movement.
That's beautiful.
And that's what Gilbert calls an amplified life, a life that's been, turned up a notch.
I could see that.
But let's be real for a second. Fear is a pretty universal experience,
Okay.
right?
Absolutely.
I know I've got my own anxieties and what ifs.
We all do.
Gilbert herself talks about her childhood fear, that feeling of constantly needing to stop, 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 stop.
Like a record scratching.
Exactly. And she describes it as this primal instinct, like that panic reflex of a tadpole,
Oh, I like that analogy.
recoiling from anything unfamiliar.
Makes sense.
And it's interesting because it's not like our fears are unique or original.
True.
It's the same old fear for everyone.
The fear of failure, the fear of rejection, the fear of the unknown.
Exactly. It's like this mass-produced item we all get handed.
And we have to decide what to do with it.
Right. So the trick is, I think,
Yeah.
recognizing the difference between the fear that's actually protecting us, keeping us safe from harm,
Right.
and the fear that's keeping us small.
The fear that keeps us stuck.
Exactly. So thinking back to Susan and her figure skating,
Yeah.
imagine if she'd let that fear win.
What if she'd never stepped onto the ice?
What if she'd stayed stuck in that belief that, she wasn't good enough, she was too old, or whatever those voices were saying?
It's a common story, unfortunately.
She would have missed out on all that joy, all that creative expression.
Exactly. And that's the risk we all take when we let fear dictate our choices.
And you know what else is fascinating to me? That magical moment when inspiration strikes.
Ah, yes.
Gilbert's story about the book she never actually wrote, the one set in the Amazon,
I remember that one.
it really captures that feeling of, when an idea takes hold.
That spark of inspiration.
It starts with this image of a whole convent being swallowed by the jungle.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful image.
And she describes this physical reaction, chills, hair standing on end.
I get chills just thinking about it.
Even that feeling of falling in love.
Really?
Like she was completely captivated by this idea.
That's amazing.
Have you ever felt that kind of pull when an idea grabs hold of you?
Definitely like being struck by lightning.
And it's cool. those feelings, they're not just anecdotal.
What do you mean?
I mean, they're echoed throughout history in accounts of creative breakthroughs.
Oh, I see.
Think about those eureka
Um,
moments.
like Archimedes in the bathtub.
Exactly. Those flashes of insight that seem to come from beyond ourselves.
Like a universal phenomenon.
And that's where Gilbert's idea about how ideas operate gets really interesting, you know?
Okay, I'm intrigued.
She suggests that ideas are these independent entities, almost like they have a life of their own.
Interesting.
They're swirling around us, seeking collaborators.
Like they're looking for a home.
Exactly. But here's the thing. We're often too distracted to even notice them.
I can relate to that.
We're checking our phones, worrying about deadlines, replaying old arguments in our heads.
The mental clutter.
Exactly. So no wonder those ideas move on, right?
I'm like, okay, I'll find someone who's actually paying attention.
And that raises the question, how do we become more receptive to those creative whispers?
That's the million-dollar question.
How do we say yes to an idea when it arrives? Because sometimes, saying no is necessary.
Right, if the timing isn't right.
If it just doesn't feel like a good fit,
I've been there.
But Gilbert also talks about this fear of commitment.
Ah, yeah.
The fear of the work involved.
That can be a big one.
It can be overwhelming.
Totally.
And that leads to this fascinating concept of the contract we make with creativity.
That contract. What do you mean?
Like a set of rules and expectations we bring to the creative process.
Okay. You'll follow
And
that.
Gilbert points out that the traditional contract in our culture is often one of suffering.
Suffering.
This idea of the tortured artist.
Oh.
Like we're almost told that great art can only come from pain and struggle.
That's a dangerous myth.
It can be incredibly damaging,
In so many ways.
It can lead to self-destructive behaviors.
Absolutely.
To this belief that you're not a real artist unless you're miserable.
Like you have to earn it through suffering.
Exactly. And Gilbert argues for a more joyful and cooperative approach,
I like where this is going.
It's about taking care of yourself, finding pleasure in your work, building healthy relationships.
Creating a sustainable creative practice.
Yes. It's about recognizing that creativity doesn't have to be a battle. It can be a dance.
A dance. I like that.
So going back to Gilbert's story about the Amazon novel,
Okay.
she gets this amazing idea.
Right. The convent swallowed by the jungle.
But then, life happens.
What happened?
She falls in love, travels to Italy, time passes.
Yeah. Okay.
And by the time she's ready to actually write the book,
Yeah.
the idea is gone.
Gone. Like vanished.
Poof. It's like the idea got tired of waiting and moved on.
That's so strange.
And what's even wilder is that shortly after,
Right.
her friend Anne Patchett publishes a novel
Okay.
that's eerily similar to the one Gilbert had envisioned.
You're kidding. What are the chances?
It makes you wonder if the idea was actively seeking a collaborator,
Like it was meant to be.
And it found one in Anne.
That's incredible.
And that's where Gilbert's concept of wizardry comes in.
Wizardry. I like it.
It's like there's this mystical element to creativity. It's not just us conjuring ideas out of thin air.
I see.
It's about partnering with something larger than ourselves.
Something magical.
And that brings us to the idea of permission, which plays a huge role in Gilbert's perspective.
Permission to create.
Exactly. And her upbringing seems to have really shaped her views on this,
Tell me more about that.
Her parents, while not artists in the traditional sense,
Okay.
they lived their lives with this incredible sense of creative freedom. They pursued their passions alongside their responsibilities,
Like what were they into?
Her dad was an engineer, but he kept bees, raised goats.
That's awesome.
Her mom was a homemaker, but she could build and fix anything.
Wow. Sounds like a pretty amazing environment to grow up in.
It was. And in that environment, Gilbert learned that creativity wasn't something you needed permission for.
It was just a natural part of life.
It was a birthright,
I love that.
She never had to ask, can I be a writer?
You just did it.
She just started writing.
That's powerful.
And I think that's such a liberating message for all of us,
Why is that?
Because it takes the pressure off, right?
Right.
It tells us that we don't need a degree, a fancy studio, or someone else's approval to live a creative life.
It's inherent within us.
Exactly. It's our birthright, just like Gilbert's parents showed her.
And how do we tap into that? How do we give ourselves permission?
I think it starts with recognizing that urge to create.
That impulse to express ourselves.
To say, hey, I'm here, I exist.
Yeah.
It's in our DNA,
It's part of what makes us human.
Whether we express it through words, paint, music, even gardening.
There are so many forms.
The essential impulse is the same.
That desire to create.
And to do that, Gilbert says, we need to cultivate a fierce sense of entitlement.
Entitlement.
Not in a negative way,
Good.
not in a self-centered, I deserve this kind of way,
I'm energetic.
but in the sense of owning our right to
Yeah,
create.
we deserve to take up space with our creativity.
Exactly. It's about standing up to that inner critic
That voice that tells us we're not good enough.
and saying, I have a right to be here making my art.
It's about believing in ourselves.
And it's something we need to reaffirm, like daily.
It's an ongoing practice.
It's a constant process of reminding ourselves and the universe.
That we're serious about this creative journey.
Exactly. And that, I think, leads us to the next essential element, persistence.
All right, let's talk about persistence. So we're talking persistence. And Gilbert has some intriguing thoughts about schooling for artists.
Yeah, she doesn't shy away from addressing those tough questions.
Especially, when it comes to the financial side of things.
Right, the whole debt thing.
Yeah, it's a big consideration for artists.
Huge, especially when there's no guarantee of success.
It's a gamble for sure.
It is, and Gilbert worries that some students might be seeking validation from those programs.
Validation? Like, what do you mean?
Like they're hoping a degree will somehow prove they're a real artist.
I see.
But ultimately, it's the work itself that grants you that legitimacy, right?
The blood, sweat, and tears.
Exactly. The hours spent honing your craft, the dedication, the showing up day after day.
Regardless of external recognition.
And it reminds me of Gilbert's own journey in her 20s. She didn't go to grad school for writing.
Really? Interesting.
Instead, she worked all sorts of jobs.
Like what?
Waitressing, bartending, even a stint as a ranch hand.
Wow, that's quite a range.
She was immersing herself in life,
Gathering material.
observing human behavior, using those experiences as fuel for her writing.
That's a great way to look at it.
Like she was creating her own curriculum.
A hands-on approach.
And she also formed this writing group with friends.
Oh.
They called it the Fat Kids.
The Fat Kids. Love it.
It was this supportive space to share their work, offer feedback.
That sense of community is so important.
It is, and they held each other accountable.
It's like a built-in support system.
Exactly. All without the pressure and financial burden of a formal program.
And it worked for them.
It did, which shows you that, sometimes you don't need those institutions.
You can create your own path.
And speaking of mentors,
Oh, yeah?
there's that classic anecdote about Gilbert meeting filmmaker Werner Herzog.
Herzog. I love him.
She was complaining about, the lack of opportunities in filmmaking.
Yeah, it's a tough industry.
And his response, he basically told her to steal a camera and make her own movie.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
He was all about self-reliance,
Taking ownership.
not waiting for someone to give you permission to create.
He was a force of nature.
It's about recognizing that the drive to create comes from within, right?
Not from external rewards.
And that ties perfectly into Gilbert's decision to pursue writing for the sheer joy of it.
Yeah.
Not for fame, fortune, or even social impact.
She was in it for the right reasons.
She understood that intrinsic motivation was what would sustain her,
The love of the craft.
And I think that's something we often forget in today's world.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the external validation game.
So true with social media and all that.
Likes, followers, all that jazz.
It's almost like we've been conditioned to seek approval,
We need to remind ourselves why we started creating in the first place.
Exactly. It's about that initial spark of passion.
That inner fire.
Which, speaking of passion and creative expression, there's that story Gilbert tells about the fan who completely misremembered a key detail from Eat, Pray, Love.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
It's funny, but it also highlights a really important point, I think.
What's that?
The fact that we can't control how others will interpret our work.
Once it's out there, it's out there.
Trying to do so is like, trying to control the weather.
A futile effort.
It can lead to all sorts of creative blocks,
I know that feeling.
Gilbert believes that as creators, it's our right to simply put our work out there.
So let it stand on its own.
Without feeling obligated to defend or explain it.
That's a powerful perspective.
And it's incredibly empowering, especially for those of us who struggle with, self-doubt or the fear of judgment.
It takes the pressure off.
It does, and it allows us to create from a more authentic place, I think.
Trusting our instincts.
And, it's important to acknowledge that there are situations where creative expression comes with real risks.
Absolutely.
Think about artists living under oppressive regimes, for example.
Their courage is remarkable.
Their work can be seen as a threat, and they face real danger for expressing themselves.
That's a whole other level of commitment.
But for many of us, especially in the West,
Yeah.
we have the privilege of approaching our work with a sense of playfulness.
Playfulness, yes.
And that brings us to the wonderfully eccentric Tom Waits.
Oh, Tom Waits. He's a legend.
His anecdotes about how song ideas come to him are like pure gold.
Tell me one.
Some come easily, like dreams taken through a straw.
That's poetic.
Others require more effort, like digging potatoes out of the ground.
He's got a way with words.
He even talks about like the different personalities of songs,
Really?
how some are like wild birds that need to be approached gently.
That's beautiful.
He's so playful and imaginative in the way he describes it.
It's contagious.
And sometimes even after all that effort, a song just isn't ready to be born.
It had
He's learned to respect that,
to let go.
to trust that the right song will find its way to him when the time is right.
That's a tough lesson to learn.
It is, but it's about surrendering to the process,
Mastering the timing of things.
And that speaks to a larger point that Gilbert makes, I think, about detaching from the outcome, not getting so fixated on a specific result
letting go of expectations.
that you lose sight of the joy of creating.
It's about the journey, not the destination.
Exactly. And sometimes, the most unexpected creations emerge
When we least expect it.
when we let go of our preconceived notions.
And allow ourselves to be surprised.
It's like life is what happens when you're busy making other plans.
So true.
And that brings us to this central paradox that Gilbert identifies.
Okay, what is it?
Creative expression must be like the most important thing in the world to us. And it also must not matter at all.
Whoa, that's deep.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Between passion and detachment.
Yeah, like on the one hand, we need to pour our hearts into our work.
Be fully present, fully engaged.
But on the other hand, we need to be able to detach from the outcome.
Not get too attached to the results.
Release the need for external validation. Trust that the process itself is enough.
It's a tricky balance.
It is. It's like walking a tightrope,
I can see that.
And I think Gilbert's own writing process is a great example of this.
How so?
She talks about how she dedicates herself fully to each sentence.
Okay.
But she's also willing to discard it without hesitation if it doesn't serve the overall work.
Wow, that's discipline.
It's about being ruthless, but also, trusting your gut.
It's like a dance, isn't it?
It is. It's like a creative tango full of passion and precision.
And a lot of trust.
Yes. And that's what we'll explore next, how Gilbert views trust in relation to creativity. Okay, so we're diving deeper into this whole idea of trust, right? How it fits into this creative dance that Gilbert talks about.
It is a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
Because it can feel a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah.
To trust something as elusive as creativity.
Exactly.
But Gilbert really makes a strong case for shifting our perspective,
Yeah.
Instead of seeing creativity as this fickle muse that we have to constantly appease,
Right.
what if we see it as a collaborative partner, one that actually wants to work with us?
I'd like that.
She even suggests that we need to cultivate a sense of, love and reciprocity
Okay.
in our relationship with creativity.
Love and reciprocity with creativity.
It sounds a little out there, I know.
It does.
But she draws a parallel to how we might approach our connection with nature.
Nature.
Yeah, she shares this wisdom from her friend, Robin Wall-Kimmerer,
Okay.
who poses this really thought-provoking question to her students. She asks, do you love nature? And do you believe that nature loves you in return?
Wow.
And it's interesting because often the answer is no.
Right.
We tend to see ourselves as separate from nature, or even like a destructive force.
Yeah, we've messed things up pretty bad.
But Kimmerer argues that without that sense of reciprocity, we miss out
On what?
on the opportunity to be co-creators of life.
Co-creators of life.
But I think the same principle applies to our relationship with creativity.
Yeah.
If we're approaching it with fear and distrust,
Right.
if we're constantly worried that it's a limited resource,
Like it's going to run out.
exactly, then we might actually stifle our own potential.
We're blocking the flow.
So it's about cultivating that sense of trust, believing that our creativity loves us, wants to work with us.
Even when it feels like it's hiding.
Exactly, even when it's playing hard to get.
Because sometimes it does feel that way.
Oh, for sure.
And this is where Gilbert introduces that trickster archetype. The trickster.
Yeah, she suggests it's a more playful and empowering way
Yeah.
to engage with creativity,
Okay.
as opposed to, the martyr
Right.
who's always consumed by suffering and self-doubt.
The tortured artist.
Exactly. The trickster approaches creativity with a sense of curiosity, humor,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
A little mischief.
a willingness to experiment, to not take themselves too seriously.
I like that.
It's about trusting that the universe is on your side,
Okay.
that it wants to play with you,
Yeah.
that it will reward your efforts with unexpected gifts and opportunities.
So it's not about forcing things.
Well, it's about, like, riding the waves,
Going with the flow.
recognizing that the creative journey, it's not a linear path.
It's messy.
It's an exploration, full of twists and
Full of
turns,
surprises.
absolutely delightful surprises.
And you know what else I love? How Gilbert encourages us to reframe our language around creativity.
Our language, like how...
Moving away from those violent metaphors,
Oh, right.
killing our darlings or breaking the spine of our work.
Those are pretty intense.
They are, and she suggests that we adopt a more nurturing and collaborative approach,
Okay.
recognizing that our creativity is a part of us, not something to be conquered.
It's about working with it, not against it.
And I think this shift in perspective can be incredibly freeing,
Why is that?
It helps us release those self-imposed limitations that keep us stuck.
Those inner critics.
It's about trusting that the creative process itself is intelligent, that it will guide us in the right direction if we just listen.
If we surrender to it.
And this trust, it extends to the final act of creation.
Putting our work out into the world.
And that's where the real vulnerability comes in.
That fear of judgment, of rejection.
It can be paralyzing.
It can.
And Gilbert, she has this brilliant reminder, she says.
What's that?
They aren't. They weren't. They never were.
What does that mean?
She's talking about those imagined judges.
The ones we build up in our minds.
The ones whose opinions we fear the most.
Yeah, I know those judges.
She's saying that they don't actually exist.
Yeah. They're figments of our imagination.
Yeah, and it's so liberating to realize that,
It takes the pressure off.
it does. It allows us to create from a more authentic place.
Without that constant fear of judgment.
And that brings us to the idea of done is better than good.
Ah, a classic mantra.
It's about recognizing that perfection is an illusion
The trap.
that can keep us stuck in a perpetual state of incompletion.
Always striving for something unattainable.
And Gilbert's own experience with her first novel is a perfect example.
Tell me about it.
It was far from perfect, she admits that,
Right.
but she finished it.
And that's what matters.
And that act of completion, it gave her the confidence to keep going.
To trust the process.
Sometimes, those imperfect creations can lead to unexpected breakthroughs.
Like happy accidents.
Remember the story about Gilbert's short story, Pilgrims?
Yeah, the one that got rejected over and over.
And then years later, it caught the eye of an editor at Esquire.
Wow, talk about persistence paying off.
It's like the universe has its own timing,
It often does.
And that's why persistence is so crucial. It's about trusting that if you keep creating, keep putting your work out there, eventually it will find its audience.
The right people at the right time.
But it's also about managing expectations, right?
Recognizing that success in the creative realm is often unpredictable.
There's no formula.
It's about finding that balance between pursuing our passions,
And also being realistic.
about the realities of the creative marketplace.
Because, let's face it, it's not always easy.
And that brings us to the final piece of wisdom that Gilbert offers.
Okay.
This idea that creativity is a divine gift, a connection to something larger than ourselves.
It's about recognizing those moments of accidental grace, right?
Those unexpected bursts of magic.
It's like catching a glimpse of the divine.
A reminder that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves.
And I think that's what's so beautiful about Gilbert's perspective.
It's inspiring.
She invites us to embrace the mystery, the uncertainty, the paradoxical nature of creative living.
To find the joy in the process.
And to trust that the universe has our back, even when we can't see the bigger picture.
That's a great note to end on.
It is. So to wrap things up, I want to leave you with a final thought from Elizabeth Gilbert.
All right.
The universe buries strange jewels deep within us all and then stands back to see if we can find them.
That's beautiful.
It is. So happy digging, everyone.